Yeah, I mean, that's probably a bad thing. Maybe. I mean, there are texts that might be useful. A lot of the texts we've actually already seen, so it might be less essential. Do you have it on? It might just be a little bit easier. It's not essential. Yeah, that's the one. Maybe, yeah. I think it's probably fine to follow it out.
So welcome to the second session of the workshop. And so now we have our second speaker, Marion Durand.
Seems to be muted.
Okay, so welcome to the second session, and now we're going to have the paper makings of fictional entity by Marion Durand. Welcome, Marion.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to Ricardo for organizing this. It feels like such a treat to be here. So as a sort of caveat, this is my first pass at this paper. If anyone read the abstract, I will no longer defend the view that I said I would defend in the abstract. I changed my mind. So just the first flag. And in general, I feel like I'm still feeling my way around a little bit. So I'm treating this as a work in progress, and we are, in fact, among friends. So that's the sphere in which I hope you will receive the paper. I think I'm struggling a little bit to see the wood for the trees in my own argument. And so I'm going to hope that you can help me with that. A lot of the argument depends on intuitions that I have, but that may not be shared. And so part of what I want to do today is test those intuitions and see where we collectively land. And so I'm going to some extent, fall short of drawing some firm conclusions. And instead, I'm going to do something a little bit more conditional and disjunctive. So if we have some kinds of intuitions, this will follow. If we have other kind of intuitions, this will follow. So that's the sort of general strategy that I'm going to take, and I hope that's okay. I should also say that I'm going to take a fair amount for granted. Thankfully, Ricardo has set out a lot of ground that I was going to take for granted, and now I think I can because it has been taken for granted already. But I am basically going to assume that we're up to date on basic Stoic ontology and debates thereabouts, particularly with regards to something and the supreme genus. I have included a sort of pretty brief recap at the top of my handout, which is what I effectively take to be roughly uncontroversial, and then people will debate the details on there. But basically, I take it that we have something. There might be a sort of non-supreme genus of not something, but maybe there isn't if you're Victor Kasten. Something is going to be divided into existence, which are bodies, and non-existence, and that's going to include incorporeals, and it may or may not include other things. And obviously, one of the questions is going to be where exactly in this do fictional entities fall. I'm also going to assume that we're more or less au fait of basic Stoic philosophy of language. So I'm not going to say what lecta are. I assume we know that. I assume we know that they're expressed by and distinct from language, that they're incorporeals. And more specifically, I'm going to assume that we understand what propositions are. Again, I hope that's okay. And I hope that I don't lose anyone as a result of that. Okay, so my general question for this is trying to figure out what fictional entities are on the Stoic view of basic ontology. And I think that's an interesting question for two reasons. The first one is that given their ontological commitments, fictional entities seem like particularly relevant beasts because it's not entirely clear where they're going to fall given the sort of corporealist ontology that they're working with. And then there may be, the question is maybe all the more interesting that the Stoics themselves seem to be interested in that question, both from an ontological point of view and also more generally. I mean, Chrysippus is engaging with poetry a lot, and so with fictional entities. He's dealing with Medea, for example. He has books on how we should read poems. And so it seems like it might be relevant for him to have thought a little bit about the sort of ontological underpinnings of the kinds of entities that he's working with in those works. So for those reasons, I think it would be good for them to have a worked out view. But there's very little evidence. Actually, I had a sense that the evidence on this wasn't great, but it's significantly worse than I thought it was. as I realized when I got stuck in. And I think the existing scholarship kind of obscures just how thin the evidence is on fictional entities specifically. And so I think it's kind of sensible to take a fresh look. Much of the scholarship to date has looked at fictional entities kind of incidentally as part of a larger discussion of ontological modes of being. I don't think there's been a single sort of direct engagement with the question of fictional entities independently of sort of those other questions. And usually fictional entities are treated by analogy to universals or concepts, but not because the evidence states, as we might be led to think from some of the discussion, that fictional entities are like universals, but rather because universals are described in terms that make them sound like fictional entities. So universals are described as figments of the mind. And so I think that's led people to think, oh, well, so are fictional entities. So probably whatever we say of universals are going to hold of fictional entities. But I don't want to take that for granted today. And the literature also seems to me to be tackling the question of the ontological status of fictional entities in a slightly question-begging way, because usually it gets to it by having carved up the ontological space into something and not something, or existence and non-existent, some things and so on. It asks, well, where do fictional entities fit in this space? And do fictional entities put pressure on the theory as reconstructed, given the sort of thing that fictional entities are? But I take it that the sort of thing that fictional entities are is exactly what's up for grabs. And so we shouldn't be basing it on the sort of assumption about that. And so what I want to do today is take a slightly different approach and getting to that question by way of semantics, by asking what sort of things we can say of fictional entities. And by that, I mean what sort of things we can say of them truly, and what that might tell us of what sort of things they are. Now, there's a risk that by assuming the kind of thing that we can truly say of fictional entities, I'm actually begging the question in exactly the same way that I suggested the literature does. But I think it's a little bit more permissible, at least insofar as some of the things that I'm going to assume that we can say about them are not inherently to do with their ontological status. And as we get to this, I'm also going to try and be a bit sensitive to this worry. And that's partly why I think intuitions are going to need to be questioned. And because I'm not entirely confident in my own intuitions, as I said, I'm not going to defend a strong line here. What I'm going to do is try and present the evidence to help us see what, depending on our intuitions about what sorts of things may or may not be true of fictional entities, what we might want to commit the Stoics to. With more time and more data on our collective intuitions, I think we might be able to draw some firmer conclusions. And so in short, where I think I'm going to land is that given certain intuitions, fictional entities might end up being either nothing or quasi-some things, or whatever we take concepts and universals to be. Or if our intuitions go the other way, there might be an argument that particular fictional entities, which I'm going to distinguish from universals of fictional entities, particular fictional entities might end up looking like something, which I take it might be an odd result. Okay, so I am making here a methodological assumption, which I think I ought to defend a little bit, which is an assumption that the semantics can be revealing of the ontology. And I think the reasons for that are going to become a little bit clearer. And to some extent, I think, even in Ricardo's talk, that there was some of that in the background. But let me say a few things about why I think that might be true in the Stoic system. So I take it that language and lecta, and here I'm going to conflate the two and speak loosely, language and lecta are natural in origin. And one of the things that leads to is that they naturally map onto the world and its order or its structure. I also take it that language is communicative, and that what it communicates is some kind of representation of the world. So language sort of represents or captures the world. I use that very loosely. I'm not committed to representational talk. And I take it that the way that language sort of communicates things about the world in this way that it captures it is precisely because it maps or it matches the world and its order and its structure. And I think that goes right down to a granular level. So bits of language or lecta match up to bits of reality. And how that manifests itself in the Stoic theory is that we see ontological distinctions matching and in fact justifying or motivating semantic or linguistic distinctions. One example of that is a distinction between demonstratives on nouns on the basis of a distinction between matter and qualities. And so the general idea is that language and lecta, because its purpose and function is to represent or capture reality, is such that its structure and its syntax, its sort of bits, are if not determined by, such as to match the structure and the bits of reality. And if that's right, then we can learn about reality and its structure as the Stoics conceived of it by looking at language and its structure as the Stoics conceived of it. And we can learn about ontology and the ontological distinctions that the Stoics might have made by looking at language and the semantic distinctions that the Stoics might have made, as well as looking at things like truth conditions for given propositions. And so that's generally what I propose to do. Okay, so I'm going to start by laying some background on semantics, the things that seem to hold of the semantics, and then look at how that might apply to fictional entities and what lessons we might draw from that. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to need to know is that the Stoics distinguish between three different types of propositions, and this is passage 1 on the handout. So of the simple propositions, some are definite, some indefinite, some middle. Definite are the ones expressed dictically. For example, this one is walking, this one is sitting, or I'm indicating a particular man. Indefinite propositions, according to them, are ones in which something indefinite governs. For example, someone is sitting. Middle propositions are ones such as man is sitting or Socrates is walking. Someone is walking is indefinite because it has not delineated a particular walking individual, for it can be expressed with reference to each of them in common. On the other hand, this one is sitting is definite since it designates the person indicated. And Socrates is sitting is middle, according to them, since it is neither indefinite, for it has delineated a species, nor definite, for it's not expressed with deixis, but it seems to fall between the indefinite and the definite. Okay, so we get these three types of propositions. We have a similar passage in Diogenes Laertius that uses slightly different terminology. I'm just going to adopt the Sextus terminology because it's a little bit easier. And we basically get these three big types of proposition, the definite, the indefinite, the middle. The propositions seem to be distinguished on the basis of their subject. So the subject of a definite proposition is a demonstrative, the subject of an indefinite is an indefinite pronoun, and the subject of a middle proposition is a noun, either proper or common. And more specifically, what seems to distinguish these different types of propositions is the semantics of their subjects. So a pronoun picks out an individual, and it does so deictically, we're told. It's expressed with deixis. A noun seems to delineate a species, and that's what sets it apart from the indefinite, according to the final sentence of that passage. And an indefinite does neither. So it doesn't refer to a particular, it doesn't delineate a species, and it's and the middle is not expressed with deixis, so it's in between the sort of thing that is not referring at all and the thing that refers very specifically because it itself delineates a species. Okay, so the first question that we might have is using what sort of word can we refer to a fictional entity, or at least say something about it, or what sort of proposition should we expect to encounter in claims about fictional entities? Now, I take it that we can't refer to a fictional entity using a demonstrative. I think that's not too question-begging of an assumption. There might be the possibility of doing that in cases of anaphora. I don't take those to be deictic, so I'm just going to rule out the possibility of having a definite proposition with, as its subject, a fictional entity. Something, so the indefinite, I think is slightly more difficult. Now, we're not going to refer to a fictional entity using something because something is a non-referring expression, as we get from this text. But we might be able to say something like, something is a flying horse. Or something is Pegasus. And then the question is, okay, well, can we say that truly, or can we say that in a way that's sort of interesting? And determining that is going to partly depend on how we answer the question about what Pegasus is. Is it something, does it have the kind of ontological status that's required to verify a sentence like Pegasus is something? And I'm going to come back to that. It's also a difficult question because, interestingly, we seem to be told, and this is in passage 2 on the handout, that something is walking is true only if the corresponding demonstrative, this one is walking, is true. So this is passage 2. They say that the indefinite, namely someone is walking or someone is sitting, is true whenever the definite, this one is sitting or this one is walking, is found to be true. For if no individual is sitting, the indefinite, someone is sitting, cannot be true. Now, given what I've said about the deictic, if that's right, it would suggest that actually fictional entities can't verify indefinite propositions, right? You couldn't have, if you can't have a this is Pegasus, then you can't have something is Pegasus. I have some worries about this passage and this dependence relation, but I think it's enough reason to, for now, bracket out those sorts of propositions. And as we'll see, we're going to have to come back to them, but for now, I'm going to set them aside. And so that leaves us with middle propositions, propositions that have as their subject nouns. And those have two main interesting characteristics for our purposes. The first one has to do with the semantics of nouns specifically. And that involves, firstly, the fact that nouns delineate a species or a concept. That's what we got in passage 1. And also a claim that nouns somehow signify qualities. We get this from passage 3. According to Diogenes of Babylon, the common noun is a part of speech which signifies a common quality. For example, man, horse. A proper noun is a part of speech which designates a proper quality. For example, Diogenes and Socrates. I'm not entirely clear what to make of this, but at a minimum, it sort of suggests that in the general semantic picture of nouns, qualities feature, as well as the eidos, which I take to be the concept. Okay, so that's one thing about the semantics of nouns. The other thing that's interesting about the semantics of middle propositions is that, as we've seen from Ricardo's talk, middle propositions can be used to make two different kinds of assertions. We can make particular assertions or universal assertions. And these have apparently different analyses or different logical import. We've got reports that those two are sort of importantly distinct. And we get this, so we encountered this. I think Ricardo had a slightly different passage from my 4 and 5, but they amount to the same thing. The idea that a particular proposition of the form Socrates walks actually says something like there is, or can be analyzed as there is some Socrates who walks. So in 4, we get they offer as evidence for this that it is possible that both Callias is walking and Callias is not walking are false at the same time, but contradictory opposites are never false at the same time. For they say that if Callias does not exist, Callias is not walking is no less false than Callias is walking, since in both what is meant is that there is a certain Callias, and that walking or not walking holds of him. However, it is not the case that Callias is walking, can itself never be false, when the affirmation Callias is walking is false. So this is a point about the negation, but what it gets us is this analysis of the middle proposition Callias is walking as there is some Callias who is not walking. And this is echoed a little later in passage 5. Furthermore, of the proposition which we call a negation, Socrates is not alive, is false because it means there is a certain Socrates who is not alive. The proposition which says Socrates died will also be false for the same reason, since it will mean there is a Socrates who died. They do not speak correctly when they say that Socrates died is ambiguous, and in one sense which is false, is composed of a name Socrates and a verb died, and in the other, which is true, is inflected as a whole form from Socrates is dying. So this is both about the negation in the past tense, but again, what it gets us is this analysis of Socrates thighs as there is a Socrates who thighs. Now, contrast that to what seems to be the case of universal assertions, which is what we get from passage 6, and we've seen this passage in a longer form in Ricardo's talk. Someone saying man is a rational mortal animal says the same thing in meaning, albeit different in word, as someone saying if something is a man, it is a rational mortal animal. Now, these two are not usually treated as reporting quite the same kind of information. So in the case of the particular, this is usually taken as an analysis. So it's not a claim about what's being expressed. The lecton that's being expressed is Socrates walks. And that's thought to have as logical import, or it's thought to imply in some sense that there is some Socrates who walks. But the thought is in that the sentence Socrates walks has expressed the proposition there is some Socrates who walks, right? The proposition is Socrates walks. And that somehow bears some relation to there is some Socrates who walks. By contrast, in the case of the universal, the claim is usually taken to be that what has been expressed is in fact the universal conditional. If something is a man, it's a rational animal, it's a rational mortal animal. So there the claim is the sentence man is a rational animal has in fact expressed a proposition which is conditional in form. If something a man is a rational animal. So there's a sort of asymmetry here about how those passages are interpreted. And I do just want to raise a worry because it has given me pause in the process of writing this paper, putting those things side by side. Because it's not obvious to me that we ought to have these differing analyses of, or these differing interpretations of the passages. The phrasing, at least, don't seem to me to justify treating them as different. In passage 6, the duname, which is the thing that's here translated as different, the same in meaning, but different in word, the duname, doesn't seem to me any stronger, and in fact, it's possibly weaker than the turns of phrases that we have in the Alexander, where we get semi-nomenon. So the thing that's signified is, and in the passage that Ricardo has, the thing that's said. Now, I would be uncomfortable suggesting that the sentence Socrates walks, in fact, expresses the lecton, there is some Socrates who walks. I think that would be a very bad result. I think it has to be that the proposition at a lexical level is Socrates walks. I mean, for starters, if it wasn't, we would have turned the middle proposition into an indefinite one. That seems really problematic. But I think it does leave open the question of exactly how we understand the analysis of that middle proposition, right? It's not lexical, but it is somehow logical. And the more I think of it, the less I'm sure what it means. And whatever we think about that, it does make me wonder whether the claim about universals might perhaps be understood in the same weaker sense. So duname in Sextus shows up multiple times to mean something like roughly or virtually. And so maybe it could be understood not as a claim about what's expressed at the lexical level, but something a little bit weaker, just as we understand the claim about the particular. I take it that might be problematic for views like the one that Simon and Susanna Bobstein have defended. And so I'm sort of wary of pushing that too hard. I'm going to bracket it for now, but I do want to flag that I think there's some thinking that needs to happen here. And that a result of all this is that I'm going to be speaking very loosely in what follows and kind of imprecisely because I'm going to have to blur the line between sentence and proposition because I'm kind of on the assumption that the usual way of interpreting those passages is correct. We're dealing with a mix of both. I don't think any of that is going to really obscure the points that I want to be making, but I do want to flag that there's going to be some imprecision there. Another question that I want to raise because it's going to become relevant, and Ricardo's actually already touched on this helpfully, is how to understand the Este in the analysis of the particular. Now, usually people who look at this, and that includes myself in previous work, and that includes Ricardo in his talk, have talked about the existential import of the particular propositions, claiming that nouns somehow have existential import and maybe imply the existence of their referent. And one reason to sort of think that way is that the worry that's raised by Alexander in passage 5 about Socrates died kind of requires that the is taken in some kind of strong sense, at least to mean something like is alive. But as Ricardo discussed, it can't be a very strong sense, so we can't take it to mean to exist in a sense that's true of bodies, but false of incorporeals, not least because we can say true things of incorporeals, right? I can say the proposition P is true, and that's presumably going to be analyzed as there is some proposition P, and it is true. But if we take the is in that first conjunct, or in the first conjunct as meaning exist, then it's going to turn out to be false because propositions don't exist because they're incorporeals. So at a minimum, the is in the particular analysis has to be something that can be said of both bodies and incorporeals. I'm inclined to take it as just copular here, so it doesn't carry any stronger meaning than that. but I don't really want to commit to any more than that. But just sort of to flag that that's how I'm taking the is in this. I'm also kind of on the same ground going to ignore the fact that there's a tis that shows up in that. So tis Socrates, right? There's some Socrates who died. I suspect it's not technical here, but we can talk about that if people feel inclined. Okay, and the last question that's kind of worth teasing out before we try to apply all this to fictional entities is, well, it's not so much a question as I'm just going to say that it seems to me that the theory, as I've laid it out, only allows for particular propositions about particulars and universal propositions about universals. And that's actually going to bear on some of the stuff that Ricardo talked about as well. So you can't have an analysis of Socrates walks as if something is Socrates, then he walks. The sentence Socrates can't express or be understood as having expressed, or whatever we think is going on there. It just can't mean if something is Socrates, then it walks. And that's the difference, I take it, with Aristotle, who's inclined to treat proper names as universals that are instantiated just once. So Socrates is pale is treated as all humans are pale in the syllogistic. I could be wrong about this, but I'm inclined to think that the Stoics are going to make more of the fact that Socratesness is a peculiar quality, and that it's important that it's instantiated just one, and that the ways in which it's important is precisely that this sort of sentence is not and cannot be one that expresses a universal proposition, because Socrates denotes something that's fundamentally particular, not universal. And then on the flip side, I also think that you probably can't have man walks as understood as a universal, as that is about all humans, read in the particular analysis. So you can have a man walks, and the Greek may be ambiguous between a man walks and if something is a man, it walks. But man walks, if meant as a universal, must be understood as if something is a man, then it walks. We might object to that it looks as though, at least when theorizing, we can talk about the universal man, which is what Ricardo did throughout his paper. And we see, for example, Sextus Empiricus discussing exactly this when he claims that generic presentations are neither true nor false, because the generic man is neither Greek nor barbarian. I've put this text somewhere, text 6 in the appendix. But even here, he has to specify hogenikos anthropos to make it clear that he's talking about the generic man, which suggests that it's not a natural reading of hoanthropos to read it as referring to the generic man. And in fact, the intended subject is a particular, namely the universal man, whatever kind of object that is. That's the intended referent, rather than all men. So at best, it can be used to refer to the concept, the particular universal, but then it's a case of a particular assertion, but it can't be used genuinely as a universal and preserve that shape. So if that's right, that's going to give us propositions about particulars, which take the form of x is f, and are analyzed as there is some x, which is f, and I've put this on your handout. Or actually, on the handout, I've tried to get rid of the is, so x phies, so there is some x who phies. And propositions about universals, which take the form of if something is x, then it is f. Or if something is a g, then it's an f. Okay. One last thing, because I think I'm flipping between one and the other. There is some x who phies. I take it that that's logically equivalent to there is some x and they phi. So I'm going to sometimes use a conjunctive, an explicitly conjunctive form, but I take it that that's the same thing. Okay. So having laid all of that ground, how does this apply to fictional entities? Okay, so the first thing, as I flagged it, is that I take it that there are potentially two types of what we might call fictional entities, namely particulars and universals. So take Pegasus as opposed to centaurs, taken generically, or a centaur, taken generically. In some ways, I think the universal kinds are easier because, well, I should say that I'm kind of persuaded by the Brunswick line that we needn't worry too much about the Stoics making a distinction between universals that are natural species and universals that are fictional species, at least not insofar as they're universals. It's enough to distinguish them. Brunswick says on the basis of that from which they are formed, that is, whether there's an empirical basis or not. I want to modify that a little bit because it's not so much how they're formed, because I take it that you could form things. Well, the way that he frames it leaves it open. that there might not be a distinction between universals that are formed by some mental process, but which are not fictitious. One example that we get, I think I put it, it's passage 1 in the appendix, is you could form a concept of Socrates on the basis of a representation of Socrates. That's not a universal, but you could imagine that you form a concept of horse on the basis of representation of horses, but that's importantly different from the concept of centaurs that you might form through some kind of either mental process. So really the thing that matters is that they have or do not have real instantiations, those universals. But either way, it seems to me like there will be grounds to distinguish the fictional ones from the non-fictional ones without those grounds needing to be inherent to them qua universals. So for that reason, I think the status of universal fictional entities is a bit less problematic because it's just going to end up being whatever we think universals are. But I'm still going to treat them together with particular ones because I think it leads to some interesting observations. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some assertions that I take we might be inclined to make about fictional entities, and I've listed them on the table. And then I'm going to say something about what I take the sort of intuitively desired truth value for those to be. So ideally what we want, what the truth value we would expect for those various assertions. And then I'll work through the analysis that we should expect for each of them, given the semantic background that I've outlined so far. And we'll see whether the analysis yields the right kind of truth value or not. Okay, so the assertions that I'm looking at are Pegasus does not exist. Pegasus has wings, a centaur does not exist, a centaur is fearsome, and a centaur is half man, half horse. I take all three of those to be universal, so it's A meaning generically, but I'm keeping it in the singular to mirror how Greek would do it. But I intend 3 to 5 to be generic. Okay, so let me say a bit about each of these. So Pegasus doesn't exist. I think it would be a good result to be able to truly assert of a fictional entity that it doesn't exist. So I have assigned that a desired truth value of T. I take it that on the picture that Ricardo painted earlier, that would have no truth value. I take that to be undesirable, right? I take it would be good to be able to say things about fictional entities. Pegasus has wings. Again, I think it would be nice if we could say true things about fictional entities, about the properties that we expect those fictional entities to have versus the ones that they don't have. So contrast that to Pegasus is a cow. It would be nice if Pegasus has wings turned out to have a different truth value to Pegasus is a cow. I also think that it might just turn out to be false because fictional entities don't in fact have any properties because they're fictional. And so in other words, it might be the case that that turns out to be false. And I don't think that would be devastating for the theory. So I've put T question mark to note that it would be nice if it were true, but it wouldn't be devastating if it turns out to be false. Okay, by analogy to the particular cases, a centaur doesn't exist. I think it would be nice if we could say of centaurs that they don't exist. A centaur is fearsome. I mean, we could have just a simpler example here of a centaur as a cow. That's just an example of something that I take. It would be nice if that should turn out to be false. One or another, I take it that should turn out to be false. I used fearsome because I think there are interesting things that happen with concepts in ethics and the sort of the misapplication of concepts. And there are two ways that this might turn out to be false. So it might turn out to be false in the same way that Pegasus has wings might turn out to be false because a centaur being a fictional entity just doesn't have any properties. Or it might turn out to be false because whatever properties centaurs do have, they don't have the property of being fearsome. And so that would be an error at the level of concept. And I think that's the kind of thing that the Stoics are kind of interested in. It's a different kind of sort of error. But anyway, I'm just looking for an example here of something that's false. And then lastly, a centaur is half man, half horse. Like Pegasus has wings. I think it would be nice if that turned out to be true, not devastating if it turns out to be false. Okay, so what analysis do we get of each of these and what truth value do they get? So Pegasus does not exist. There's a question here of how to deal with the negation. And I think I want to revert back. The handout changed, I think, 5 times. And I think it needs to change a 6th time. I'm not happy with this. But one way is to pull the negation out and say, not there is a Pegasus who exists. That's going to turn out to be true, right? On for whatever reason, that's going to turn out to be true. Given the evidence that we have in passages 4 and 5, I think there might be reason to actually read this as there is a Pegasus who does not exist. So not actually taking the negation to have completely wide scope. That's a little bit more interesting. And that's more interesting because whether that turns out to be true is going to depend on what we take the true value of there is a Pegasus. And that there we sort of start having some problems. Now, that's only going to be true on a certain reading of is. And I suggested that a sort of weak reading might be possible, but it's certainly not true if we take is to mean exist here. But as I've said, I don't think it should. And that's going to, I mean, that question is also going to arise for there is a Pegasus who has wings anyways, right? That's going to basically whether there is a Pegasus and there is a Pegasus who has wings is true. That's going to hinge on basically the same thing, which is partly whether you can say true things of functional entities at all. Now, I think that's interesting because it shows that even Pegasus does not exist, given the analysis, there is a Pegasus who is going to hinge on, potentially hinge on, depending on how we read the negation, whether you can say there is a Pegasus at all. And I think that one way to think about this question is precisely to think about it in terms of qualities, much in the way that Ricardo was doing. So we've seen that the semantics of nouns are such that man and Socrates both signify qualities. And that seems to sort of play a part in, or at least I think, in referring to their respective referent. And we might think that what Pegasus signifies is the property Pegasusness. And if we think that qualities are bodies, and that they're sort of in some either appearing or instantiated or whatever we think of that, we're going to have a problem with the quality Pegasusness, which presumably is not such as to be out there, a body in the world. I think that there's one way, I'm going to skip a little bit here, but I think that there's one way to resist that line of thought, which is at a minimum to point out that we might have the same kind of problem with incorporeals. So I can presumably say the proposition P is true, and that doesn't take it. I require that there's a quality in that sort of strong corporeal sense of propositionness. In fact, presumably propositionness can't be a sort of corporeal quality. It can't be a body. And I don't know, that's maybe I'm getting something wrong here. And there's some people here who have thought about this a lot more than I have. So it'd be good to know what you think. But I take it the proposition P is true, or just the proposition is true, can be verified by an incorporeal and isn't threatened by the fact that there's no corporeal quality propositionness that the incorporeal proposition somehow instantiates or has. And so that's right. We might think that whatever the property Pegasusness is at least sort of similar to the property propositionness, or at least that there's room in, there's sort of conceptual room there to make that the case. Mostly this is to flag that there's some weird things happening with quality that we're going to need to sort out here. And it would be great if I wasn't the one to sort it out. So I'm looking out to you guys to help me out. Okay, and so all of this, as I said, is also going to play out in there is a Pegasus who has wings. Because first it's going to play out in there is a Pegasus. It's also going to play out in how we think that having wings relates to Pegasus or Pegasusness. And here I think this is getting a little harder, but it might end up being the case that this has to be false. But if we sort of weaken the truth conditions for there is a Pegasus, we may be able to weaken the truth conditions for having, like, that thing having wings, whatever kind of thing it is, turning out to be true. And that might be similar to what's required for incorporeals, which might suggest that fictional entities are not like any other somethings, but they're at best like non-existent somethings. That would be completely unsurprising. And if we think that that's not even possible, then they might end up being sort of nothing at all. Okay, so that's for particulars. Now let's look at the universals, or the generics. Okay, so those are all going to end up being analyzed as, or they're going to be thought to express, if something is a centaur, then it doesn't exist, it's fearsome, it's half man, half horse. Now, centaurs don't exist. That's either going to end up being trivially true or non-trivially true, but either way, it's going to be true. And that's going to depend on what we take the truth value of something as a centaur to be. So if something is a centaur is false, then a centaur does not exist. That's going to end up being trivially true. One question is, does it amount to a claim that a centaur is a something in the sort of technical sense? I don't think I can take a view here without begging the question, so I'm going to push that aside for now. The second question is, does it have the truth conditions that are outlined in passage 2? Namely, does its truth depend on there being a corresponding definite proposition? So is it the case that something is centaur can only be true if I can say this is a centaur? If so, then that's definitely going to turn out to be false, and so it's going to be trivially true. Now, because that's true, whatever we make of it, I think it's not super interesting because we want it to be true. So I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is centaurs are fearsome. Again, if the antecedent turns out to be false, then that's going to end up being trivially true. I take that to be a bad thing. I think we want this to turn out to be false. So that in itself might be a reason to resist a view according to which something as a centaur is necessarily false. I'll say right away that we still have, whatever we do will have the problem of the truth value being dependent on the definite. And I'm just going to bracket that out because, again, I think that that passage is dodgy. And so I'm not going to take that as reason to think that that has to be false. And instead, I'm going to suggest that we need to think about this kind of seriously. So either we can, to sort of block the falsehood of something is a centaur, either we can say that something is a centaur is not a strict claim and telling that a centaur is something, if somehow we have an intuition that fictional entities cannot possibly be some things. And so we say that it's not a use of a technical something. And that might be a bit easier, I take it, if we think that this is an analysis of the generic rather than what's expressed by the sentence. Or we take the claim that centaurs and so fictional entities are some things. Note that that only requires that a particular centaur be a something, right? So we don't need centaurs, the universal, to be a something. We just need particular centaurs to be some things. And that obviously doesn't require it to be an existent or a body. It just requires to be a something, much in the same way that I suggested Pegasus might turn out to be something when I was looking at the particulars. And that might be a way of sort of blocking the falsehood of something is a centaur, and that would be a way of getting 4 to be false. Okay. Centaurs are half man, half horse. That's basically going to turn out to hinge on exactly the same thing as the previous one. So I'm just going to skip ahead because I'm running out. Okay, before we take stock, I do want to say one thing, which is I take it that we, well, there's a question about whether we could apply the universal analysis to the particular and vice versa. I used to be inclined that the answer might be yes, and that would get us out of a lot of problems. So if we could say, if something is Pegasus, then it has wings, that's a way of getting 2 to be true without sort of any ontological commitments, which might be nice. But I'm no longer so sure, because after all, if there is some kind of quality, fictional though it may be, of being Pegasus or of Pegasusness, then it's a peculiar one. And so Pegasus is quite clearly intended as the name of a particular, albeit fictional, thing. And so I see no reason that it should behave any differently from Socrates. And so without importing other assumptions, which is precisely what I'm trying to avoid doing here, I don't see any reason to treat Pegasus as such that it could give rise to some kind of universal reading of Pegasus does not exist. And similarly, I'm inclined to think that a centaur generically would behave in just the same way as man generically would behave, and I don't see any reason to try and analyze it in any different way. Okay, so let's take stock. What all this, and I realize I went through this a little bit fast, and to be honest, I'm looking forward to questions because I think I haven't fully worked out all of the implications here. What this shows us is that nouns that pick out fictional entities seem to behave a lot like other nouns. But exactly how like other nouns is going to depend on the kinds of intuitions that we have. So we might think that they're similar just on a surface level and that things break down really quickly, because as soon as we consider the analyses, of the kinds of propositions that are expressed using nouns, we're going to get all sorts of weird truth values when the things that are intended as reference are fictional entities. And that might make us inclined to place fictional entities as entirely out of the realm of some things, and consider them to be not some things, treat them maybe analogously to concepts or generics or universals, whatever we think of those entities. And we might think that they're similar to those, and that it's very difficult to say anything of the universal man, because most things are going to turn out to be neither true nor false of the universal man, and so on. And so that might have some benefits given certain intuitions about fictional entities and their semantics. But depending on exactly what we think, I think that does risk yielding what I take to be counterintuitive truth values for those sentences. Now, there are much worse things coming out of Stoic ontology than not being able to say that Pegasus does not exist. And so I don't think that that's a sort of devastating claim. Maybe that's fine, but I think we should be aware that that's something that we're going to be committing ourselves to if we do that. And we might think that that's reason to actually push back on those sorts of views. We might think that those nouns, in fact, behave like other nouns, and that might suggest that the fictional entities have a status that's a bit less ethereal, that we should take Seneca seriously when he claims that they're part of reality in some sense, that they too are something, maybe, at least insofar as there's something to talk and think about. And that would draw some kind of middle ground amongst existing views, preserving and insisting on Brunswick's distinction between fictional species and fictional particular, and the associated concepts, and still allowing that fictional particulars are part of reality in some sort of stronger sense. I'll stop here. Thank you.
This one is different now. Open discussion. So, yeah,
very much. There is a lot of interesting material here, and I need to project it further. But I just had a small question of clarification, probably missed something about your example before and some issues that you were finding. Did I write that the problem is that because the antecedent is false, something is a center. Well, at least if we think that is false, then the problem is that the condition is clearly true.
Yeah.
And then all such conditionals, well, condition like a center is person will turn out to be true. I wonder whether you shouldn't worry too much about this, because in these types of conditionals, I assume that what must be underlying them is a conception of the phenomenon which is not the Philonian one. It must be the synthesis or something strong there. Because otherwise, really, you could say that any random proposition like a square triangle has 18 sides turns out also to be true simply because there is no square triangle. But there is a difference between a square triangle has 18 sides and the square triangle has 3.5 sides, or something like that, in which you could see how you could think that the two things go together. So if you have in mind the kind of Principian conception of these, and then the question is no longer the truth values of the propositions, but the question is whether there is a relation of Mache, of conflict of some kind, or akousia. And then perhaps the question is it part of the concept of center? Something that you haven't mentioned, perhaps here the question goes a bit. Enoemata and concepts. Wouldn't the truth, what you are using to assess the truth values of these conditionals, not to look at the truth values of the two clauses, but to look at the concept of center and see, well, if it's part of the concept of center to be gentle and helpful, that is incompatible with peacefulness, and that gives you exactly the reason to say that condition is false because the contradictory of the consequent doesn't see. So
thank you. Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. That has to be right. That the conditional has to be the notion of conditional at play here has to be one where the relevant truth conditions are the Chrysipian ones, and that's helpful to some extent. I think where I get off the boat with your question is in that very last point. So it is to. So I take it that it is to do with the concept of centaur in some way, but. Let me. So if I say a man is if something is a man, it's a rational animal. The thing that makes that true, as opposed to if something is a man, it's a donkey, right? Isn't that like the concept of donkey or like donkeyness is at odds with things to do with the concept of man? Is that if you go around and you look at every man, none of them are donkeys, right? Like I take it that's if we take the propositions, the sort of conditional seriously, and we take the truth conditions thereof seriously, the things that are going to make true or false each the antecedent and the consequent have to do with the objects in the world. That
is something you said before about the indefinite being. I think it's verifier in a definite one, and you were saying, "Oh, I'm not sure about that." So I wouldn't be sure even more.
Oh, I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. I guess I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. In that, I'm not sure that you need. Well, I'm just not sure what to make of that passage. I will say.
I'm not sure whether man is more rational for a Stoic is true because, as a matter of fact, all individual mans more rational, even because otherwise, well, what about men who are not born yet? Are those included or not?
I think that's going to depend on that. I think they can answer that using tense. So I'm actually not worried about that. Yeah, I mean,
if in the case of man, you don't want to say that there's to do with the noema or something like that. In the case of man, at least to be a man is a common property, I suppose.
Yeah.
There is some ontological fact, something in the world which, by which manhood is incompatible with donkeyhood. But again, it is not the fact that there is no individual man that you have ever met that is both the man and the donkey that is relevant.
Yeah, good. So I think I'd be happy to say something like centaurness and fearsomeness are incompatible. And that's enough to make the
whereas in the case of man and donkeyness, man is in fact a common property. Centaurness is not, I suppose. Well, or at least you could create a.
Well, it could be a fictional common property.
In those cases, what you're looking at is the noema, so you have this kind of fictionalism by which you assess these propositions on the basis of what thoughts human beings have created about entities. And then you can account for things. So in a way, it would be different application in the case of centaurs and in the case of human beings, because in the case of human beings, you either have common properties which perhaps doesn't exist in the case of centaurs. That's just a suggestion. But
yeah, no, that's helpful.
The point which I thought was perhaps more important is that whatever direction you want to go, don't feel that you need to answer the kind of belonging problem.
No, that's very well taken. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. But I don't really need to ask very much, but I suppose I could just, I saw it precisely in the sense that I think this would be helpful because by appealing to this notion of back then to answer this, you can avoid those problems. I suppose the only thing I could add is that it kind of raises problems about 1 and 2, though, of course.
Yeah.
Because, particularly what helps with 3 to 5 is that the condition is not truth functional. But in the account you give 1 and 2, it is just straightforwardly truth functional.
Yeah.
So I suppose if that were the solution, the 3 to 5, one might be maybe tempted towards trying to give some kind of other analysis of 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Perhaps a conditional analysis. But otherwise, you're just going to have completely different types of explanation It's going to be two groups of guys.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it might be something. I guess you could have something like, maybe you can say true things of generics, of like universal fictional entities, but not particular ones. I don't like that that seems like not very desirable, but that could be a result. That's exactly why I was originally motivated to take a conditional analysis of Pegasus, because that does solve a lot of problems. And then you can apply exactly the same sort of reasoning, and you can apply to the concept, whatever it is. But that, I think that's more problematic than it seems for the reasons that we were just starting to get into. But yeah, that's something I need to think about. Thank you.
Yes. I have several questions, but one of them is this, is that, you were asking, rightly, of course, if there is a way in which you could assign a different truth value to a centrist person and a centrist is a cow.
Mm-hmm.
No? And so what was exactly your...
No, sorry, I want both of them to be false.
Yes.
I want to assign a different truth value to a centaur as a cow and a centaur as half man, half human.
Okay, fine. So what was your solution? I mean, what was your proposal? Because is it the idea that the concept of centaur and the concept of cow they clash with one another? No, there is some kind of incompatibility. Or Mahe is the term in this process. So that that's why that proposition is false, whereas a centaur is half man, half horse is true.
Mm-hmm.
But the trouble, yeah,
Well, can I just say one thing? Is
yes.
that I'm a little bit nervous about the talk about concepts clashing here. I think I would be more comfortable with the thing of which there are concepts being the things that clash. Of course, in the case of fictional entities, it's not clear that there is a thing of which there are concepts, which is why I would be inclined to think it would be nice if there were something of which there are concepts. It's just not something that exists. But that's kind of the nerve. That's where my slight nervousness in answer to Luca towards the end comes from, is that I don't think that the thing that makes a centaurist fearsome false, or I'm not convinced that the thing that makes a centaurist fearsome false is that the concept centaur and the concept fearsome clash, but rather that the things of which those concepts are concepts clash.
Fine, but as you said, the trouble there is that there is no such thing as centaurs. So
well, that's what we're assuming, right? Yeah.
That there is no such. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes, I mean, so that's the trouble, and I think that this kind of thinking is implied in your passage 1, no? Where not the one about guidance.
In the appendix. Yeah. Sorry. Diogenes version 60 to 61.
Yes, exactly.
On page 3.
Passage 4. It says, well,
I realize the error of my ways now, having numbered.
For they say that Callias doesn't exist. Callias is not working, is known as false, and Callias is working. So, both are false. Both Callias is working and Callias is not working because Callias doesn't exist. So, if we start with the assumption that there is no center, then the center is a cow and the center is not a cow. Both are false. No?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was in the so that was one question. The other question,
so can I maybe answer that very quickly?
Yeah.
So one way of avoiding having exactly that analysis applied to the centaur is to firstly take that the exist here is not a sort of strong claim. Wait, I'm getting this wrong. Yeah, that's right. And then to deny that that's going to be true of centaurs. So it's not exist in the sense of exist qua body as opposed to qua something else. It's like some kind of looser use of ani here. Right. And then you say, well, whatever is true of centaurs that's not what is meant by Thales here. That would be the sort of general idea.
Right. Okay. So the idea would be that centaurs are something.
Yeah.
But they are not bodies.
Something like that.
Yes, of course. And which is what Longan said too. They think that fictional entities are something.
They're non-existent somethings, yeah.
Right, yeah. And they are not like universal.
Yeah. And I realize that that's a view that everyone has pushed back against, right? So it's there are reasons that that's not a problematic view.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I wonder, do you know of any source that says otherwise? That namely that says that fictional entities, particular ones, not universal, but particular, that they are nothing at all, or they
are nothing at all.
Yes. No. So they also disagree that we are so.
Well, I mean, the only claim that we have, as far as I know, directly explicitly about a fictional entity is in Seneca, where Seneca says that there's something. That's the only thing we have, and it's not exact, which is the text that you have here, which is not reliable. I mean, I don't think that that's sufficient evidence that there's something. To be clear, but that's the only direct explicit evidence that we have about this status of fictional entities, as far as I know.
Yes. Of course, so if centaurs are something, then clearly you can have different truth values for centaurs and cows. Now, my other question is very quick. I mean, why? So the reason why you cannot analyze proposition like Pegasus is, or even in the case of existing things, not like Socrates. Socrates is Athenian. You cannot analyze that in terms of Rennick's effect. Socrates is Athenian because Socrates is a particular, and the deeper reason is that Socrates doesn't have instances, right? I mean, because if you held that Socrates is a property that is only instantiated once, but still a property, then you could perhaps argue or analyze a proposition like Socrates Athenian as a universally quantified, or for any entity, or
why not? Because I take it.
Exactly,
I mean, there's an almost sort of pragmatic answer here. That's just when I say Socrates walks, this is a particular assertion. It cannot be understood as a universal assertion. And
I mean, the intuition is clear. Is there any?
Well, so what I suggested was that it's not so much about, it's not that Socrates-ness isn't instantiated, it's rather that Socrates-ness being a peculiar quality, somehow the distinction between peculiar and common quality comes to play here in flagging or something, the fact that that's fundamentally a particular assertion. And there's no ambiguity, it cannot be understood as a universal assertion. And I mean, they do call those conditionals universal. They use, they're Catholica. And Socrates is walking just isn't that kind of assertion. So, I mean, there might not even be a more worked out reason than that. It's just that when we speak and we think about what's been said, when I use the sentence, Socrates is walking, you cannot understand me to be saying, if something is Socrates, it walks. That's just not the lecton that's being expressed. That's not the lecton. There's no ambiguity there in the way that there is when I say anthropos, peripete, that sentence is ambiguous. You might understand a particular man walks, or you might understand generic, if something is a man, it walks. So there's an ambiguity at the level of language, which gets resolved once we look at the level of lecta, because in one case you have a particular, in one case you have a universal. In the case of Socrates walks, there's no ambiguity there. That sentence is just not ambiguous. That's the sort of general idea.
Thank you. Actually, very much in the same vein. I want to point to your first appendix passage, the BL 760-61, where we get apparently the claim that also context can sometimes be a species.
Yeah. Yeah, which I take that to be the case. Yeah. So
you could, from your last remarks, I get that you might not want to do this, but you might think that there are usages. I'm going to try to put this very vaguely, but there are ways in which a proper name may occur where it doesn't work in the way reported in the common proper quality passage. And notably there is no article, right? Whereas in the PL passage, there is an article. I don't know if we should put an emphasis on that, but it is nevertheless a fact. And if so, we could think that there are two ways in which we might think of the sentence Pegasus as wings. One is universal, one is particular.
So the idea would be proper names, just like common names, can give rise to ambiguity between particular and universal kinds of assertions. Understood, particularly the claims about Pegasus are going to turn out to be false. Understood universally, claims about Pegasus are going to turn out to be true. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah, that's the view. Yeah, that's the view that I have a footnote somewhere in a paper where I say exactly that. And that's the view that I thought I was going to defend in this paper. And I think that's the view that I defended in the abstract. I mean, that's nice in that it gives us a way of understanding those sorts of claims. It's not so nice in that it seems to me like not a very intuitive way to understand what is being said by those claims.
I mean, fair enough. I mean, one way to look at this, which was the impetus for my take here, was just that we have these two texts, right?
Well, so I take it that when Socrates being an eidos is not a claim. That's the kind of eidos that's like the most specific kind of eidos. So that's basically just saying Socrates, there's a concept. Socrates, right? It's not saying there's a universal that has multiple instantiations that, you know.
Well, you might think that that doesn't matter. That just has to do with how broad it is. I mean, this is what we were getting at.
Yeah. I guess, so the one hesitation that I still have is that on my general understanding of the distinction between peculiar and common quality, this is the last thing that distinction is still doing, is motivating that sort of distinction. And if it doesn't do that, then why are they distinguishing at all? But maybe that's just that's a different kind of
one very nice thing that would come out of this is just that we could then provide a sense in which fictional entities have a kind of reality, although of the most tenuous kind, just like universals.
Yeah, good. So here's another. So here's another worry. Then it looks like when you say Pegasus has wings, if you think that's true, right, as opposed to Pegasus is a cow, then it does look that the thing that you're referring to is the concept, as opposed to the thing that it's a concept of. So if you think that or you think that there's an additional entity of which the concept Pegasus is a concept that has exactly the same ontological status as the concept.
Well, I don't know. I mean, this isn't really an answer, but I would think that this would be handled in the same way as Chrysippus would handle universal predications more generally. Just by way of conditional analysis, I mean.
Oh, I mean, that's on a semantic level, that sounds right. I was thinking more on like a sort of ontological level, like what is it that we're talking about, even within that analysis. And I take it there's like an entity that is truly said to have wings. That entity, which is truly said to have wings, has the status of the universal or a concept, and it's not obvious to me that having wings is a thing that an entity of that kind can have. And so if it can't, then it can't be true that it has wings, and then we're still at the problem of, do you follow?
No, yeah, for sure. I mean, I would be inclined to assimilate all of that to the admittedly very tough analysis of what it is for an enema to be Hosane, Hoyan, and Hosaneti.
So like Hosane has wings.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. That's kind of helpful. Okay. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Marion. This is fun. I have two things to say. One is, I hope, helpful. So the proposition P is true. Incorporeals have incorporeal qualities. This is a Simplicius Categories 217. And that's 28L in Long Silence. So I don't know, like, how to interpret that claim, but that might be grist for your mill. My question is, why should we take these assertions to be truth-apt at all? And why should we take them to be expressing assertions? So here's an alternative. Pegasus has wings expresses something like a hypothetical, which wouldn't be true or false, but given a certain context, we can accept that it's true. And then we don't have to deal with whether it's true or false, or whether it's in fact verifiable.
What do you mean by hypothetical? Sorry.
Like the complete lecton, a hypothetical.
Is that not just a conditional?
I don't think so.
Okay, can you tell me more about what you take that to be?
Hypotheticals, suppose that Pegasus has wings. That's a hypothetical.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Um,
And we can just accept that it's true, but we don't have to assign it truth or falsity.
What does it mean to accept that it's true without assigning it truth or falsity?
In the same way that we can accept that it's true for the sake of an argument that there are 10,753 stars in the sky.
I understand. Okay.
Yeah.
So
we don't have to worry about verifying. We can just accept that it's true for.
So two worries here. One is, why would Pegasus has wings do that and not Socrates walks?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, so part of what I'm trying to do is sort of not, the reason I'm asking that question is part of what I'm trying to do is not sort of like arbitrarily, based on what we know those entities to be, assume that the kinds of things that are expressed about them take certain forms, because I take it that in everyday language, like if you didn't know that Pegasus was a fictional entity, you would have no way of knowing that my assertion was of that kind, as opposed to of a proposition. Like there's no transparency there. And we don't have any evidence that Chrysippus has corrected those sorts of assumptions when he was sort of in his sort of normative moments about language. So I would worry that like there's no flag anywhere that when I say Pegasus walks, I said something importantly, really relevantly different from when I said Socrates walks. So that's one worry. Okay. The other is that it ends up looking to me a lot like the conditional analysis. Okay. Right? If you say, like, suppose Pegasus has wings.
Sure.
We can sort of accept this to be true in this sort of hypothetical sort of way. Is that not just the same as saying if something is Pegasus, it has wings, and that's true?
Okay, so what about this? These are instances of quasi-speech. So
Why?
they don't actually express something they look meaningful. I mean, just like those test cases and sophisms, or actor speech, parrot speech. It looks meaningful, but I can say something like Pegasus is blue-haired. Right? It's meaningful, but first of all, how do we verify, and also
Yeah. So I guess that's good. Thank you. I take it that was kind of sort of Ricardo's line was that you just can't express propositions about these sorts of things because they're not some things. And I guess I kind of want to push back against that because my intuition is that we want the truth values that I've outlined here, and on such a view, none of these have truth values, right? And like maybe that's right, and that's definitely, I can see how we might defend a view of that kind. But that seems to me like not a great result, that you can't truly say anything about Pegasus, presumably not even that he doesn't exist. I think it would be nice if we could say of Pegasus that he doesn't exist. But yeah, I think that's probably the next best thing, is just to say, there's like, they don't have a referent, like there's a weird thing that happens there, and you've just not expressed the proposition when you've said this, and so those things, whatever you said, that's not true fact. There's no true value. Yeah. Thank you.
Simon?
Thanks. You're very interesting. Yeah, sort of to continue along Sose's idea. I mean, might be tempted to have this sort of view. I don't have it myself, but I'm just saying you might be tempted to. So in your appendix 5, right, you get some impressions are neither true nor false, because they have the wrong sort of objects, namely the gemikos anthropos. And then in appendix text 1, there's this mysterious anatupoma of a horse that's somehow related to the enoema of the horse. And then in the Seneca passage, he says they have an imagino, the fictional entities. So you might think, if you're thinking about certain objects, that disqualifies them from expressing propositions. And so you might think that there's like an object-based restriction on which impressions express propositions. And then you might have some reason to go the line that has been loaded, that thoughts about fictional entities are neither true nor false.
Yeah, good. That's a really good way of substantiating that view. I don't like it, but that is a good way of that would be the way to substantiate the view. I think part of the worry is that in this passage he also says that some are both true and false.
It's a
very weird passage, on which I have some views that are not very well worked out. But yeah, I guess that would be a way of explaining, or at least of backing the idea that whatever you have with Pegasus is a winged horse. That's just not a proposition. Again, I think an unfortunate result of that is that it's neither true nor false.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you could maybe one motivation for the project would be to sort of more generally reject that way of thinking about
fictional entities. Yeah.
Or in general about the sort of object-based.
But I guess at least you would want to be able to say that Pegasus doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And on a view like that, you wouldn't even be able to do that, either than through the conditional analysis. But then the conditional analysis would give you another way of just getting false. Pegasus has wings, or right. And I take it that the conditional analysis leaves open the door for Pegasus has wings to be false, right? So if you want it to be the case that you can't truly say of a fictional entity that it has any properties, all you can do is somehow name it or something like that, then the conditional analysis will allow you to do that, because you can apply to Mackay and say, like, whatever a fictional entity is, like it's inconsistent with it that it have any property at all. So you could still have a view kind of in the vicinity of what you have with the conditional analysis, which it's good. You guys have worked me back to my view 5 years ago. That seems like a good result.
That's nice.
Okay.
Yes, thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask you something about for particular proposition, right? Like Socrates is walking, and of course, related to that, has wings that can thing. Because I mean, by what passages do both 3 and 2, I mean, it seems that the analysis is that Socrates is not a proper name, right? I mean,
Yes, Socrates is a proper name.
Stoics is that proper names are not referring expression, right?
No, I take it that it is a proper name and it is.
Predicates, right? Predicate.
Oh, I see.
So just say Socrates is
Sure.
talking.
Okay.
Because, I mean, in passage 2, they say, well, this is the middle position because it doesn't delineate, that's important. It doesn't delineate a particular individual. Socrates walking doesn't delineate a particular. So I think it would mean that it doesn't refer, it's not non-refer expression. That's what it does. I mean, it doesn't refer to a particular individual. Because, otherwise, then it would be like, this is walking. There will be a difference, right? So Socrates is walking is, there is an X that is Socrates and walks, but Socrates is a predicate there.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a proper name, right?
Well, I do think it is. I think for reasons that are in text that are not here, that the difference between Socrates and this is that they both refer to a particular, just by different means. So one refers deictically, the other refers by delineating the eidos. And those are just different ways of fixing the referent. So I'm inclined to sort of resist the view that it's not a proper name, and it's not referring.
Yes, I mean, but in page 3, I mean, this is I mean, be more clearly page 3, right? It's a different assertion type. When we talk about particular, we say, well, Socrates walks, kind of like there is a Socrates walks, and then we get XFs, there is some X webs. I mean, in this analysis, we lost Socrates, right? So, I mean, there is an X who walk, who Fs. It can be true because I walk. So we need something to fill in the logical analysis. And I thought that there is some X who Socratizes and fights.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I think this passage is a lot more problematic than we collectively have thought. Because, so firstly, it's not, right, I take it that we don't think that the proposition itself is there is some X who phies. People have usually thought that that's the sort of logical import of Socrates phies, but the proposition is Socrates phies, so Socrates isn't entirely lost. There's also a question about how to read the Greek. So do you read it as like tis, Este, Socrates, blah, 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 or do you read it as tis, like Este, tis Socrates? So there is some Socrates and blah, 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 or do you read it as something is Socrates and this other thing? Now, if you read it as the latter, it's very undeniably, you have turned this thing that was a middle proposition into an indefinite proposition, and we've just gotten rid of the middle proposition altogether. And that seems kind of problematic. So I'm not sure what to make of the sort of analysis, and how strongly to take it that Socrates walks implies that there's some Socrates, or that there's something that Socrates and that thing phies. But I would want to resist as much as possible the idea that there's sort of the Socrates walks, that proposition just is the claim there is some X who phies, there is some Socrates who walks, because that seems like problematic to me. But do you think that doing that, sort of just embracing the names or predicates view solves some problems for fictional entities? Because that would be interesting.
Well, I thought that, I mean, that what I said here, that the view that when the tis is used, also was something like there is, as you say, a certain Socrates, and by doing that, they try to use Socrates as some sort of predicate.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
But would that help with fictional entities, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I mean, you can use, of course, this conditional analysis forward, right? There's something that's Socrates thing. If there is something of which this predicate is applied, and of course you can do that with Pegasus.
But I take it you can't use the conditional analysis as well as there is some XU5s, right? It's one or the other. So if what gets us out of jail is the conditional analysis, then the particular analysis just kind of doesn't matter. And what we make of that doesn't matter. The conditional analysis is the thing that we're going to use. If we think that there's value in the particular analysis, there is some XU5s, then that has to be independent of the conditional analysis, because the conditional analysis is importantly distinct. I take it.
Yeah, I mean, you say Socrates is a predicate, right? So Socrates walks something like yes, it's right. There is an X who Socratizes and walks, right? And so with fictional entities, you get all claims are going to be false.
Unless there is doesn't mean
unless you can.
There is, right? Unless there is means something very loose.
Yeah. Unless you can, but there is not. Pegasus doesn't exist unless you can take the negation, give wide scope to the negation.
Yeah, so that would be another way of getting Pegasus doesn't exist to turn out true and everything else to turn out false.
Yeah.
That would hinge on the negation.
Yes.
Yeah. But that's not going to work for the full.
That's it, right? I mean, you can say, well, that seems correct. Pegasus doesn't exist. The claims about Pegasus are going to be false, except that Pegasus doesn't exist. And they're going to be true, of course, within the fiction, right? According to the mythology, Pegasus has wings.
I don't think.
But according to the mythology, Pegasus lacks wings. It's false. So that's what you can get, but without, let's say, taking it or conditioning into a certain story, I don't see that it is wrong to think that all things about Pegasus are false, except Pegasus.
Except it doesn't exist. And we can get that through the negation. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm thinking just a passage in Delta 8, I think, Metaphysics, where Aristotle says, Socrates is not said true, it's not said of many things, right? Because that's why you don't say every Socrates, or something like that. So that's why, I mean, Socrates, and Aristotle's thinking of Socrates as a proper name, so it is not a predicate. But in this view, it seemed to me that it was something like predicate. You can say every Socrates, perhaps, when you refer to every Socrates in every cosmos. Okay?
Thank you.
Anthony?
Yes, thank you. I know I don't have a lot of time. I just want to make the point, I hope this will be helpful. If you're concerned about the sort of single fictional object versus the general fictional object, and you think that the Stoics are fictionalists about mathematics, it seems that the Stoics do make a truth claim about a specific mathematical object when they say, and this is from the Philodemus on signs passage, that the 4x4 is the only square number to have its perimeter equal to its area. So at least if you think that the Stoics are fictionalists about mathematics, then we have at least one example of a fictional object which is specific, which has a true claim applied to it. Now, I am not sure if the Stoics are fictionalists about mathematics, and I know we're like very much out of time. I do want to hear your thoughts about this, but I guess I will reach out to you later. But I hope that does help if the fictional versus general thing you think might have like a different sort of truth schema.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I guess at a minimum it helps by saying something like, we can make those sorts of claims about mathematical entities. Whatever status we think mathematical entities have, fictional entities might have the same status. They might not be the same thing, so it needn't be the case that mathematical entities are fictional, but they could have the same kind of status, and so allow for the same kinds of statements to be made about them. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
And we have one last question.
Yes, thanks a lot for your presentation. I would like to make a Description about the analysis of six, hoping it will be fun, it will be useful for your argument. On the line, the main dynamic of Rodríguez, it is translated as say the same thing in meaning. I think we could analyze that as say potentially the same thing, like not granted only they say the same under certain conditions, maybe pragmatical condition or so, like talking about mythology or literature, but not they actually say always the same thing. I think that possibly I don't know, will you find that useful to your argument? Like you could separate, not always they say the same thing, but on the certain condition they say the same, under other different conditions they do not.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, that would sort of forefront the idea that it's ambiguous. So you could potentially say this, or you could potentially say something else, which I think is one way of taking this passage, and it's the way that that's how I sort of was taking it. But that's a good way of sort of emphasizing that. I think there's also a way of minimizing the dynamic even more, which would be in line with other places that it comes up in Sextus, but which I think some people would have reason to resist. So I think that that's a nice way of sort of pushing the point that's usually taken to be the case here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.